Irene Kim. I will be your facilitator for these sessions, and we're really delighted to have you all here today. And we have a lot of kind of important items to discuss. So, and we need your input on these hard standards. So we really ask you to speak to your values, your vision, and your questions, and also your expertise and experience. So in the, I just kind of wanted to give a quick recap of the last week's, or the tenant working group 2 weeks ago. So that tenant working group really focused on shared values, experiences, any key concerns and priorities, things that you're excited about within these hard standards. And we really also tried to orient the tenant working group around the city's efforts in developing this ordinance on building performance standards, and then and also in collaboration with the Build Shift team. So we'll introduce the Build Shift team a little later. But I also, just to kind of catch everybody up on some key highlights from that meeting, I wanted to share some key takeaways. So in that first tenant working group, we heard a lot of great input, and kind of around when we asked about any kind of key concerns and priorities that folks had, we heard that some key things that we heard were that construction costs for high performance green buildings is really a big challenge for BIPOC businesses in construction. It's also, it's been a challenge also dealing with misinformation and greenwashing. So something we heard as well. There's also lots of strong concern about rent and energy cost burdens being disproportionately falling on BIPOC communities, and also that energy efficient buildings are typically not affordable. So that's something we heard in a lot of the groups. Also that when we talked about people's experience with dealing with climate change, I think something that we heard a lot was that even the sort of natural events in the recent years, like the heat dome and all the wildfire events, was really scary for lots of people, especially frontline communities, and it's only getting worse. So a lot of folks shared stories about really serious health risks that are coming up for because of those events and the impacts that it's having on jobs and housing security. So those are some experiences that were shared in that first meeting. But there's also a lot of excitement and optimism for these for the hard standards, and really a lot of excitement around that it's centering health, resilience, and equity and displacement. So there's questions about how can we make these standards a win-win for both building owners and tenants. And then there's also a real sense of urgency, obviously, in developing these hard standards and implementing them, but also heard a lot from culturally specific and BIPOC-led organizations that that it's important that the process and the development of the ordinance is thoughtful and equitable. So those are some sort of key highlights from that first group. We also did a polling exercise on kind of the values, high-level values that that you all want to bring to the hard standards, and we did the same exercise with the building working group last week. So I wanted to share sort of the results of that, and so I'll share my screen here in a second, and kind of share with you some similarities that we saw. Okay, can you all see that? Maybe give me a thumbs up if you can all see that. Okay, great. So this was for the tenant working group. So we asked what values are important to bring to the hard standards. So a lot of thoughts on health, equity, community, affordability, justice, humanity, resilience, racial equity, empathy were all kind of common values that came up out of the tenant working group. And then in the building working group, a lot of similar values, which was really great to see. And health, equity, justice, resilience, community, access. So I just wanted to kind of start with these kind of shared values that both the building working group and the tenant working group have. And we'll keep coming back to these as we go through all of these sessions. And then, so I wanted to kind of hand the mic off to Marty to give a quick highlights of the building working group. So go ahead, Marty.
Thanks, Irene. Hi, everybody. I'm Marty Frank. Pleasure to join you at this group. So I facilitate the buildings working group, and we had our second meeting last week. Our meeting last week was focused on equitable energy, and we had two main topics of conversation. So one was the structure of this potential policy, meaning, how and when exactly might buildings be required to make these changes that reduce emissions and improve health. So we heard from both the city and the Institute for Market Transformation on this question, had some learning from them about how this can be done, how other cities are doing it. And then during the small group discussions, when we asked the participants in this group, do they have a preference or do they have an opinion? A lot of people actually said they really needed to know even more in order to make a decision on what they thought would be best for Portland. So examples of the types of things people wanted to know more about, they wanted to see more analysis to help them understand how different policy approaches might produce different impacts. And so, for example, people were curious, like policy approach A versus B, which gives us the quickest emissions reductions? How would different buildings be affected differently by each approach? And I think importantly, what would be the different cost burden, both on building owners and the occupants, the renters? And in terms of the types of opinions that people were ready to express, a key takeaway, I think, was this desire for kind of what I would call a both and policy design. So participants were presented with kind of two models of how these policies have been done elsewhere. And people really keyed in on both the benefits and the drawbacks in each approach. And we're really expressing this desire to write a policy for Portland that captures the best of both. I don't know if that's like a have your cake and eat it too situation, but I guess we will see. Another sentiment that was shared by this group, of this buildings working group, was this desire for a policy, regardless of what approach was used, but for this policy to be flexible and to really accommodate these unique life cycle timing events of individual buildings. And the desire here was to avoid putting in place a policy that has negative unintended consequences. People also were reminding the group to think about how this policy could affect building owners without substantial financial resources. How are these building owners going to be supported in complying with the policy? And I think there's a general opinion among this buildings working group that it's a real priority to not unfairly burden smaller building owners, right? Building owners who maybe own one building, who don't have a robust staff, who don't have portfolio managers who they can hand this work off to. And I kind of want to give you a sense of the balancing act that I think people were struggling with in the group last week, which was kind of balancing their concern over cost and the costs of compliance with a sense of urgency that, Irene just spoke to, that I think you all have talked about, right? The urgency of reducing emissions and protecting people from the really serious negative effects of a warming climate here. And so there was this discussion about not wanting to delay emissions reductions, knowing that even small reductions now will have even bigger benefits in the future. The second topic we talked about last week was renewable energy. We heard from 3 of our local utilities about the sources of energy that they're providing and the plans that they have for providing us with increasing amounts of renewable energy. And so the priorities that people expressed when thinking about renewables, I don't think these are going to be surprising to any of you. One of the most common things people are concerned about is the cost, but also scalability, reliability, resilience, ownership, who will own them and where will they be located. So on cost, the concern here is about how this transition to renewables is going to be paid for. And again, a concern about not putting undue burden on less resourced building owners and less resourced households. People also were reminding the group to always talk about energy efficiency in combination with renewables, right? I've heard it phrased as something like, you have to eat your efficiency vegetables before you get your renewables cookies. And then in terms of different sources of renewable energy, people raised concerns. So there were concerns raised about renewable natural gas, about hydropower, about renewable hydrogen. And there was this, again, reminder that we need to think about what are the potential negative environmental impacts of some of these renewable energy sources. There were some concerns about barriers to increasing renewable energy use, things like, just the very logistical aspects of how energy is metered and how it's billed to occupants of buildings, especially multifamily buildings. And there were concerns about the impacts on renters, right? So would this transition introduce kind of disruptions, right, into their daily life because of things that have to get done inside buildings? And finally, the discussion turned to people's preferences for where this renewable energy generation might be sited and how it could be owned. And I would say there was a really strong preference through this group for locally sited renewables over things like renewable energy credits, right? For example, rather than say building a solar installation, buying renewable energy from Colorado or Texas. It was certainly preferred by this group that this new renewable sources of energy be located close at home. And there was also a strong preference for community-owned generation when possible. That is my recap. I'll hand it back to you, Irene.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a couple more, just one more housekeeping item before we turn to our agenda here. So starting next week, the city will be hosting office hours with staff to answer, or with anyone that's interested to answer specific kind of technical questions or process questions. So Vin's going to follow up by email on that. And so those are going to be on Mondays from 4 to 5 through June 13th. And Thursdays 10 to 11 through June 16th. So I know there's lots of questions that have been coming up, and we really want to make space to respond to those questions, but also want to keep these working group meetings and try to make sure there's enough time for discussion. So if you have any technical questions or process questions, feel free to use those office hours. So I'll post those in the chat here. Okay, so let's turn to today. So today's focus is on health, resilience, and temperature standards. And I'll put the agenda in the chat here. Oops. So we have we'll have a presentation on health, resilience, and temperature standards, and then go into a quick polling exercise with everybody here, and then go into small group discussion. We'll take a quick break and then do another presentation around exposure to air pollution. And then we also have some questions that we'd love to get your feedback on in small groups as well. And then we'll go over some quick next steps in the last 5 minutes and get you out of here by 2:30. Okay, so.
Hi, sorry, this is Erika Moseson. I just, I said, I think I'm not, maybe I'm misinterpreting, but I think I'm the exposure to air pollution speaker. And I unfortunately have patients starting at 1:15. And so I'd said that my window is like 12:15 to 1. So I don't know if there's a way to flip them around or if that doesn't work, in which case I can do something some other time. But yeah, sorry, I was trying to message and I may have just been lost in the message bots.
No worries, no worries. I appreciate that. So yeah, I think maybe we'll do a little swap so that we can get you out of here so you can see your patients. So let's start with the exposure to air pollution first, and then we'll go into the temperature standards.
Can we do 5 minutes of intros too, so everybody knows who's in the room?
Yep, I'm gonna go through that next. Okay.
Thank you.
So just a quick reminder, just on Zoom control. So please stay on mute unless we're in kind of discussion mode. I'd suggest hiding, and then you can also put yourself on do not disturb on your phones and computers, so to kind of keep any distractions away. Please use the chat to pose any questions, comments. We'll be monitoring that and responding to those. And you're welcome to use any reactions as well at the bottom kind of tool menu of your Zoom screen. And then if you're having any technical issues, please also use the chat to message Wing. He's our tech person in this meeting, so he can help you out. Okay, so yeah, let's do some introductions really quickly. So I know there's lots of folks who have been in this meeting before 2 weeks ago. So we're just gonna do chats and in the chat box. If you can provide your name, your pronouns, and your affiliation in the chat, and just do a quick introduction that way. And then when we get into small groups, we'll do some more formal introductions. But for the sake of time, we're gonna use the chat box instead. And if you'd like, it'd be great if you could tell us if you attended previous working group meetings, something that you learned, or maybe something that you kind of found yourself thinking about afterwards. And if you didn't attend, feel free to put in any questions that you might have today. So welcome to do that. And then let me put in here.
Thank you, Irene. While folks are entering your names in there, I'll introduce myself too. So if you're new to this process, again, I'm Vinh Mason, the City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I use he, him pronouns. I've been with the Bureau for 14 years. Prior to that, I was a professor for 7 years. And prior to that, relevant to our conversation today, I was air quality and environmental engineer for 7 years. So I also wanted to give the folks that are part of the Build Shift team that we've been collaborating with on the policy concept an opportunity just to share your name and pronouns and affiliation if you'd like. So I'll just call on the folks that I think are here today. If you are okay with coming off video, do that, and then just hop on and share that quickly, and then while other folks are entering in their introductory information. So Derek, are you up for going first? How about Anjanette?
I'm here, man. I just had to get myself off of mute.
Oh, thanks, Derek. Yeah.
Yeah, how's it going, everyone? My name is Derek Thompson, co-director of Leaders Become Legends, and also a member of the Build Shift team.
Thank you. Anjanette?
Hello, everyone. My name is Anjanette. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a member of the Build Shift team. Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. That's our unofficial slogan. Jeremy, do you want to go next? If you're here. John, I saw that you came into the room. Do you want to go next?
Oh, sorry. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm Jeremy. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Environmental Justice Fellow with the PANO, and then also a member of the Build Shift team.
Hi, I'm Jonna Davis. She, her pronouns, also a member of the Build Shift team, Associate Director at the Northeast Coalition of Neighborhoods, and part of the Environmental Justice Committee for the NAACP.
All right, thanks, Jeremy and Jonna. How about Jordan and Nikita from CCC?
Jordan couldn't join today. She had a conflict, but this is Nikita. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the climate and energy policy manager at the Coalition of Communities of Color, and we've been partnering with Verde in the city of Portland to coordinate the Build Shift team.
All right, and Oriana. Thank you, Nikita.
Hi, my name is Oriana Magnera. I use she, her pronouns, and I am with Verde, and as Nikita said, helping to coordinate some of the Build Shift work. And my apologies, I have been very sick the past couple of days, so I will be off camera now and later in the conversation.
Thanks, Oriana. Yeah, and again, please do enter your name, pronouns, affiliations into the chat if you haven't done so already, so that everybody else here knows who's in the room. But that is the Build Shift team, climate justice experts. We've been working with them for 2 years. I'm a team member too, so it's a collaboration, and that's how we developed the policy concept, and they'll be in your small group breakouts as well. Back to you, Irene.
Irene, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Then since we're going to do a little switch here, I think we can start with the exposure to air pollution presentation.
Okay, so is it okay if I share a screen?
Actually, I'll kick that off. There is some background in there too. And I think we have you through a Q&A, right? Till 1:15, did you say, 1:10?
Yeah, I need to finish by 1. I have a patient at 1:15.
Okay. Was that 1 or 1:10? I thought I saw 1:10.
Yeah, I have a patient at 1:15. I can probably hang on with you till 1:10.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Yeah, why don't I ground us all?
1:14 if I'm sprinting.
Okay, thank you. We'll try not to make you sprint. I appreciate your time here in between seeing patients. All right, I am just reordering my presentation real quick and I'll start displaying it. I'm hoping you got the order right.
While you're doing that, this is Wing in tech support. For some reason, the chat was defaulting or is defaulting to me. So if you popped your name in the chat, it might not have gone to everyone. So just make sure that your chat is set to send to everyone. Thanks so.
Yeah, I'm glad you figured that out, Wing. I was wondering about that. My PowerPoint does not want to let me move slides. There we go. Okay, just one more to go here. Thanks for your patience, folks. And we'll have this reordered. Okay, very close. Can't remember if this was the original order, but this will be very close if not. Okay, I think that is it. All right, start sharing screen here. Let's see, can folks see that?
Yep.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, yes, welcome to session 2, health resilience and temperature standards. Okay, so for folks who are new, we are focused on rental apartments here and the experience of tenants and figuring out how to make these standards benefit tenants while reducing our climate impact. So we call them the HEART standards: health, equitable energy, anti-displacements, resilience, and temperature. Some examples of that are improving health and indoor air quality, which we'll cover today. In bold, here's what we're covering today. Building resilience to wildfire smoke and setting maximum indoor temperature limits. We'll actually be going pretty much in this order. So next meeting, we'll talk about reducing carbon emissions and how to do that equitably, and including talking about things like power outages that are related to wildfire smoke. All of these are interrelated. And then our fourth meeting, we'll get into preventing displacement of people and thinking about who pays for these improvements. Okay, so climate and health intersections. Let me just, can't quite view my whole thing. I'm gonna move around my what's open and what's not. Okay, so when we think about improving energy efficiency in the building, there is an issue in there that's intersectional with indoor air quality. And that's that sealing a building then traps pollutants with inside. So let's say if we have mold or radon as examples of two kind of toxic situations, and we make a building more energy efficient, seal it and weatherize it, we can actually exacerbate the health risks associated with those two. So we have to have ventilation. So it's really kind of this triangle here in the middle is like thinking about all three of these at once. Now, ventilation is also important for thinking about other types of pollutants that, or not necessarily pollutants, diseases. So for instance, COVID, during the last 2 years of the pandemic, we've been wanting to increase our ventilation, but that also drives down energy efficiency. So there are some technologies to dive into that. We're not going to talk about the technologies necessarily now. I'd say when you get to your breakout groups, anything you're aware of that you used in the past, please do bring that up and we'll hear about some solutions together. We'll build that knowledge together. Another area to be thinking about that's intersectional with energy efficiency is if the energy is coming from fossil fuels and there's combustion of those fossil fuels indoors, then there can be the buildup of pollutants. And so I'll provide some examples of that in a minute here. But the outdoors, if there's combustion that happens, let's say with wildfire smoke or just the pollution we have from all the cars we drive around, then that can also migrate indoors if we're not sealing ourselves from the outdoors. And there's some intersectional issues there with heat and heat waves. So I'll go into this a little more, just laying some groundwork before I turn it over to Dr. Moseson. Okay, so climate change resilience, when we think about what it's a resilience standard, really thinking about like how, when climate change is getting extreme, how do we protect ourselves in our communities? We should be expecting to see more heat waves and extreme weather events, and that's why it's important that we're thinking out in this long-term policy out to 2050, how can we really address what we might see in the future? And we got a taste for that in the last 2 years. Something else to consider, and this is from the Multnomah County Regional Climate and Health Report that came out, or was updated, came out in 2018, updated in 2021 last year. But systemic racism discrimination unjustly distributes impacts and burdens of climate change among low-income people and communities of color. Or as I might say, those who are on the front lines of climate change are also those who have experienced a lot of racism and discrimination. Another thing to point out with the wildfire specifically, this is an image that is of downtown Portland in September 2020, when we had terrible air quality, the worst in the whole world at that point, that the emergency department visits for asthma-like symptoms increased by 29%. So we need to be thinking about protecting ourselves from what's on the outside. Although we've always been exposed to outdoor air pollution because of the cars we drive, we have this now acute situation that we get from climate change during wildfire smoke events. Okay, let's bring it indoors for a minute here. Okay, so we want to be thinking about the vulnerable populations to air pollutants. So if those who are healthy, I think that's not necessarily where we want to focus. So we want to be thinking about children, pregnant women, the elderly, those who already have pre-existing conditions with heart and lung issues, and then low-income and BIPOC communities. BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So thinking about that exposure to air pollutants from combustion, there is wildfire smoke. So on the right here are some examples of indoor and outdoor sources. But the other sources that we have indoors are natural gas cooking, wood stoves, tobacco smoke if somebody smokes inside. And then in some cases, like let's point out for a particular matter, there's also pollution that can come from any type of cooking, not just natural gas cooking. So on the left side here are the types of air pollutants that we're mostly focused on right now. These are also called criteria pollutants as part of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has standards around for outdoor pollution, but they don't apply indoors. So that's why we're really looking at like what's the hazard indoor. So carbon monoxide is one of those, also called CO, causes dizziness, confusion, chest pain, unconsciousness, and death. So it's an acute effect. Nitrogen dioxide has both acute and long-term impacts. So respiratory irritation, infections, aggravated asthma, also noted as NO2 or NOx, NOx. It's one of 3 different types of nitrogen oxides. And then the last one I want to point out here is particulate matter, and we're talking about PM10 or PM2.5. The numbers there are referring to the size of the particulate matter. So 10 microns and under and 2.5 microns and under. So 10 microns and under, that's the size of our lung pores. And that's when the particulate matter isn't being caught by our lungs and spit back out. It's actually entering into our chest and then into our bloodstream. PM2.5 has the highest health risk and also is dependent on what's on that particulate matter. It's like it can be a dust, but if you have like something toxic on that dust, then it can be carcinogenic. So I want to point that out for everyone, just kind of laying the groundwork before I turn it over here. And there are some current laws. Somebody had asked earlier in an earlier meeting, are there existing policies? There is in Oregon a requirement for carbon monoxide because of its acute risk that can cause death if it builds up from natural gas stoves or backdrafts from furnaces within the homes. There is a law right now that there has to be a working carbon monoxide or CO alarm in all rentals. But it's not very well enforced. So that's something that we can build on. So just putting that out there, there are, in some cases, we do have laws. No, for the other two, nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter, we don't have the same laws. All right, with that, Dr. Moseson, I just wanted to lay some foundational knowledge there, and I'll pass it to you to share your breadth of knowledge with us.
Thank you very much. So is it okay if I share my screen? Okay. Let's see. I think this should. Oh. All right, are people seeing the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much for having me here today. I'm a pulmonary critical care medicine doctor, and I was able to move my schedule around for literally every meeting but this one, so I apologize. I do have some patience to get
Erica,
to.
could you do the full screen? It's showing the presenter mode right now.
Oh, I have it as, I thought I had it as full screen. Hold on. Swap, does that work?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, there you go.
All right, thank you. This is going to be a very brief overview. So obviously covering all of air pollution exposure effects in 15 minutes is pretty limited, but we'll kind of walk through, walk through things mostly around combustion and then what we think about indoors and outdoors. So I always just say that the slogan of a lung doctor is don't light things on fire and breathe them into your lungs. I actually put it on a t-shirt. This is a picture of my sister sending it to me during an episode of severe wildfire exposure. And I think it seems sometimes when you go to air pollution talks and you hear about PM 2.5 and ozone and NOx and oxides of sulfur and black carbon and all these things, it gets a little confusing. And honestly, the simplest way to think about these things is to think about cigarettes. Vin was completely correct. PM 2.5, the reason it's so dangerous is it's super tiny. So just think about why anyone inhales drugs, right? It's to get something into your bloodstream as soon as possible. So you inhale it, it goes straight across the little membrane, straight into our bloodstream and circulates around our whole body, causing disease from womb to tomb, right? So we know in all stages of life. So I think people are familiar with the effects of cigarettes in adults, right? Heart attacks, strokes, cancers, cognitive changes, all sorts of things, increasing risk of severe respiratory distress syndrome with COVID, et cetera. But this really starts in childhood and in the womb, actually. You get premature birth weight children, you get asthma attacks, you get worsen lung function. There's studies about MRI changes in children's brains. We have like studies about kids in diesel, school buses and increased absenteeism, asthma, cognitive changes, et cetera. And so sometimes even just thinking about, what this air quality index means, sometimes it's just helpful to think about, how many cigarettes are floating around in the air we're breathing. And so when people think about air pollution killing people, I think they're familiar, they think about things like the big smoke. So if anyone watched The Crown, there's these, series of episodes where people just kind of died of air pollution suddenly when this inversion trapped a bunch of air pollution in the air that people breathed. And I think one thing that just highlights the impact of air pollution is if people can see my mouse, you see that this was, they were measuring sulfur dioxide, but you see the death rate shoots up. Right. And then even though the air pollution goes back down, the death rate stays high. People keep dying at higher rates. So I think we think about that 29% increase in asthma visits, for example, with the wildfires. But even when that goes back down, people are still can be sick and dying from exposure to pollution. It's kind of like when someone quits smoking. It's not like all the health effects go away the next day, right? There's long-term consequences for these things. But then I think, sometimes people think, well, that's really dramatic, but is this still happening now, right? Because now, even though we've got all these cars, our air looks better than it did way back in those days. So, unfortunately, this is still an issue. So this was a very large study earlier in the early 2000s with over 60 million Medicare beneficiaries. This was a gigantic study where they looked at PM 2.5 and ozone in people's zip codes and, corrected for all hosts of things. And they just basically looked at death rate, right? And they controlled for a whole host of covariates. And what they found is that even at rates which is legal air, right, below the EPA outdoor exposure limits, although those may be coming down, there's still a linear relationship, right? And I think the analogy again to cigarettes is really helpful, right? So when we first started learning about the impact of cigarettes, everyone's like, okay, well, maybe if you smoke 2 packs a day, it causes heart attacks and strokes, but surely it can't be a problem just to grow up in the house with a smoker, right? Or to be around secondhand smoke. And we really find that it is. There's a dose response curve to this, air pollution exposure and its health effects. So even at these, lower levels. So basically, again, no smoking, right? Whatever you want to smoke, don't smoke it. And then when we break it down, we see that though everybody the whole population has an increased risk of death as we increase the PM 2.5 by 10 micrograms, right? Some people are more affected than others, right? Women, for some reason, are more protected. Maybe they're indoors more. Men are more susceptible. White populations are protected. But then you look at other populations, for example, Black population is much more dramatically affected by these increases in the zip code. And it's not explained by other things. For example, eligibility for Medicaid alone doesn't explain this. And this is where I think the history of redlining can be helpful to think about. Obviously, there's a whole host of factors that probably go into that, but certainly kind of the demographics of who's exposed to pollution are very important here. And so I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with redlining, but and there's a whole history to it that we can't cover here. But the net effect essentially is that you ended up with kind of higher value property value areas, with more single family homes, more parks, et cetera. And then you end up with lower home prices and racially segregated communities where you have a location of polluting industries, freeways, railways, all this other infrastructure done where land was cheaper, and land was made cheaper by the federal government in communities with higher proportions of patients of color, right? So you basically have less expensive housing, people more likely to rent in areas of higher pollution. And this is still, unfortunately, kind of an issue today. It's not a fairly significant issue today. So this was a study of 5,000 children in California looking at the distance from a freeway to a or other major road, right? And whiter communities live farther from the freeways, and then those and the Hispanic children, and especially those with a higher percentage of Native American ancestry, lived closer to freeways and major roads. And that correlated to nitrogen dioxide exposure, right? So these kids were much more highly exposed to nitrogen dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide is a particularly bad actor for asthma, especially in kids and airway development. So those kids living that close were over twice as likely, up to maybe almost close to 4 times more likely to have ever reported asthma compared to those living farther away. So we need our indoor air, we need our homes to be basically a clean air refuge, right? We need to filter out that ambient air pollution. We need to ensure we've got a clean air space in those settings of those wildfire events. And we also need, things like a pollen refuge, right? Pollen burden is very high at baseline in our state. And there's a whole host of things that we really need to kind of be filtered out to have clean indoor air. And then we also have to think about the air contamination sources inside the home, right? So we talked about coronavirus, right? If whole families sitting there breathing coronavirus on each other, is a pretty significant concern. Families smoking, vaping, open fires, and then the other, gas appliances, gas heating, gas stoves, dryers, that sort of thing. And basically you end up with similar threats from inside the home, right? You get particulate matter from combustion. There's a whole host of, particles that come out, but then especially, oxides of nitrogen dioxide is a particularly bad actor that can be generated in the home, again, from lighting things on fire. So in terms of gas appliances and nitrogen and oxides of nitrogen, there's a ton of studies that look at, increasing nitrogen dioxide and breathing difficulties in children, gas heaters, stoves, different cities and schools, et cetera. This is one that's, relevant for multifamily, where they, looked at kind of multifamily rental housing or multifamily housing, and looked at, exposure of nitrogen dioxide for respiratory symptoms, and basically just looked at, is it a gas stove or an electric stove in the home, right? And so the background parts per billion of nitrogen dioxide was around 20, was just kind of the background in this area. And so they found that if a home had an electric stove, for the most part, it was overwhelmingly under that level. However, if it had a gas stove, some were lower, maybe had way better ventilation, but there was a pretty high tendency for them to have a healthily elevated nitrogen dioxide level in the home. And this correlated to respiratory trouble. So they looked at, were the kids more likely to have wheezing, coughing, shortness of breath, chest tightness, that sort of thing, kind of depending on the different appliances in the homes, right? And so anything that's bolded is significant. That's more than you would expect from just statistical chance. And they did find that with the presence of a gas stove, there was a higher percentage of wheezing, shortness of breath, chest tightness. And then they also looked at, whether you were over this, average, the 20 parts per billion, it was a pretty significant increase in those episodes of chest tightness, which is kind of the, one of the concerning symptoms for asthma. So what do we do with this, right? So, it's kind of, a challenge for everybody, right? Do you replace them? Like, do you just kind of replace the source? I mean, that comes with cost and everything. Do you ventilate, right? So there's all these, studies in commercial kitchens where if you crank the ventilation fan over the stove, and you get a certain clearance rate, and you can get airflow up to 280 or whatever, depending on the size of the home. And you have people run it for 10 to 20 minutes afterwards, and you make sure they only use the back burner, that you can actually, hopefully, decrease some of these effects. But, I'm a mom and I'm cooking, for my kids. And I got to be honest, I don't always only use the back burners and run the hood for 20 minutes after, because they're noisy, right? So there's kind of like the real world side of things of like teaching people to actually do what they need to do. Or do we do filters, right? So, I think people are familiar with HEPA filters that can trap particulate matter, but if you put in a black carbon filter, into a HEPA filter, or a charcoal filter, I apologize, can you absorb a lot of this nitrogen dioxide? What can we do? So this was a study at a school where they basically looked at, the school was heated by gas heaters, and they had a bunch of kids with asthma. And so they just said, okay, well, we're going to replace half the heaters with electric heaters and see kind of how it affects our kids with asthma. And that worked, right? So they replaced the gas heaters with electric ones. All these kids kind of had similar breathing problems at baseline. And when they did that, they had a dramatic improvement in the kids who were in the classrooms that had been replaced with electric heaters, right? So their breathing improved. They had way less episodes of chest tightness during the day. They had fewer daytime asthma attacks. They had fewer nighttime symptoms, even when they went home. So that works, right? Another study that might be relevant for us here, kind of again in the real world versus, like industrial kitchens and everything, is actually this was another study of rental housing, where they kind of randomized houses to either have their stove, they had gas stoves, they either had their stove replaced, right, which obviously costs money. And then they kind of went through like the pros and cons, right? So it costs money to do it, but you don't really have to teach anybody to do anything besides that. You just replace it. The other alternative is they put in an air purifier that had both a HEPA filter and a charcoal filter to absorb gases like nitrogen dioxide. And they put one in the bedroom and one in the kitchen. So it's, expensive, and you have to run the filter, and you have to remind people to actually run it. But, that actually works for a lot of things like viruses and wildfires and all sorts of things. And then they installed a ventilation hood. And again, with all the caveats of having to turn it on. And then they just looked at what happened to nitrogen dioxide in the house, right? And this is what they found. So, again, replacing the gas stove with an electric one worked, right? So you had anything with a star is significant, right? You had a dramatic fall in the nitrogen dioxide by doing that, right? By replacing with a gas stove, both in the kitchen and in the bedroom. The air filters also worked, like the air purifiers worked. So this is a HEPA filter with a charcoal absorber to absorb the nitrogen dioxide, and that also dropped the nitrogen dioxide level. And then interestingly enough, putting the hood in didn't seem to work, and again, it's hard to know. Were they not using it right? Did they have the hood and then they just kind of figured that did it enough, but weren't running it appropriately? So it's kind of, sometimes these things get messy when you go into the real world. And then I wanted to touch again on what Vin had been saying about, the weatherizing. So this can, this has, just, it's a good thing to do, but you got to kind of remember what happens when you do it, right? So obviously it helps with heating and cooling costs. It decreases your outdoor air pollution exposure. I think a lot of us remember with the wildfire smoke being advised to kind of shut the windows, seal up the house, that sort of thing. But that comes with the risk of trapping indoor air pollution, right? So the PM 2.5, the nitrogen dioxide, when you have a bunch of people breathing in a closed space, it does generate CO2, which can be uncomfortable if you don't ventilate after a while. And then especially with pandemics, and who knows when the next one's coming and the virus spread, like that's a big issue. And then the other risks are if, as you weatherize a home, you may trap and concentrate more radon. If you have more moisture accumulation, you can kind of get more mold and everything, which can also exacerbate asthma. So we really want to make sure that we have adequate ventilation and filtration, minimize indoor sources of combustion. So like, when wildfires are going, we always tell patients, hey, this is not a time to cook, right? This is time for peanut butter and jelly, right? No extra particulate matter to be generated in the home, making sure people quit smoking and all those things. And what we really want to do is just kind of remember that there's these multi-pronged interventions that can be really helpful, right? So air filters, HEPA filters, that sort of thing can help with a whole host of things, including, particulate matter pollution, wildfire smoke, virus reduction, et cetera. And so I just always remind people that our homes breathe too, right? So when you're trying to think about healthy home interventions, you basically want to don't light things on fire and breathe them in your lungs, right? So you don't want combustion particles from the outside. You don't want much combustion inside. And then just to kind of have a more holistic way of thinking about it. So I know that was like drinking from a fire hose, but it's, hard to cover all those things in 10 to 15 minutes. It's an immense topic and there's a whole host of things I didn't cover. I do kind of try to cover topics one by one at Air Health, Our Health. And then there's a bunch of references, and I believe we'll be sending a PDF around later with some of those. But if people have questions, I don't know what the time is here. Okay, I think I did it in 15.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erika. Really appreciate it. Yeah, and we'll follow up with copies of the presentation and send them to you all. But yeah, we'll do maybe, let's see, 10 minutes of Q&A here. So yeah, any questions for Dr. Moseson? And feel free to use the chat, or you can also unmute yourself if you'd like, or you can also raise your hand as well.
I see a comment about age of equipment and maintenance of the equipment. I'm sure that's true. I think one thing we always talk about, like for patients and stuff, is like for medical interventions, it's like you kind of want to just find something that works. It's the easiest to explain, like having things that are hard to explain, or that people actually have to do things, is like active things, like reminding people to turn on air filters and reminding people to turn on. I mean, I'm even bad at, and I'm a lung doctor, I'm bad at using my hood, just because it's so noisy, and I have 3 kids and they run around and they make so much noise on their own. But yeah, all the equipment stuff, and just kind of making sure you're thinking for something that's going to work for 20 years, not, die on you in 5 minutes. I can't see all the hands, so because I've got this, or should I put the slides down? I can do that too.
No, it should, if you raise your hand, it should pop up on the top of the
How about
grid.
you call on people if anyone raises their hand?
Yeah, any questions at all for on this topic here for the group, or comments?
I had a question. I was just curious how today's indoor air quality compares to like previous decades, and kind of where we're at in the journey of thinking about policy and then impacts of policy, and just how much really is there opportunity to really reduce and improve, or reduce particulates and increase air quality, or are we at this inflection point that's really hard to, that last mile kind of concept of being difficult to achieve?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. So, studies of indoor, we don't have the same studies for indoor air quality that we have for outdoor air quality, because, as part of the Clean Air Act, all these monitoring stations were spread across the country. You can look at different studies. And I think the thing that's shocking is it really varies. Like this can be a difference of like house to house, right? Like, so radon levels in one home, for example, can be sky high. And if you whenever patients will say, oh, I looked it up, there's not radon in my area. I'm like, that's not a thing. Like you got to test, right? And so I do think these monitors are getting a bit better. Like, and it's interesting, even just, I've kind of gotten interested, and I've installed a couple in my house, and even just seeing how these things can really fluctuate. And now that we're studying it more, like there really are, you can see pretty significant health effects, which I think sometimes there's this mystery of, well, people are like, well, where did this heart attack come from, or this asthma attack? And it kind of seems like it comes out of nowhere. And I think, increasingly we're seeing that a significant burden of things that seem like random disease probably are actually related to the, the air we're breathing. And so I think it's still, I don't think there's a general thing. I think in general, we could say things like, for example, there's randomized trials of installing HEPA filters with carbon cores, like for people who have airway disease. And there was one done recently in the patients with COPD, and it decreased their rates to go into the hospital. I mean, they can be a big deal. So ensuring that you can keep low particulate matter, low nitrogen dioxide in the home, I do think really does help. And I'm hoping that with these monitors getting cheaper and more studies around building standards and everything, that we'll have a better thing. But I do think, especially with climate change and more wildfires and everything, I don't think we're at a point where we blow this off. In fact, I think this is a point where we kind of double down and pay way more attention to the indoor air quality. I've actually bought one of these for one of my patients. Like I bought him a PM 2.5 monitor because her COPD, I shouldn't do that. Don't tell anyone I did that. But to like just put it in her house because her COPD is so bad. No, it's just like, when the fires are bad, you keep driving that thing down. If your kids go tell them to get you another HEPA filter, unless till that thing gets low, because she's so vulnerable.
Great. Thanks, Erika. So I see 2 hands up here. We'll go to Jordan and then James. And I think that we might not have more time for additional questions, so we'll stop there. Go ahead, Jordan.
Am I frozen or?
Great, thanks so much.
Oh, there might be a lag.
Thanks so much. That was a great. My question is about mold. You mentioned it a little bit in the beginning, and I was just curious about what you see about the relative risks of mold versus what a lot of your, I think, presentation focused on was, combustion byproducts.
Yeah, I think the mold part's hard, just mostly because the data is very variable. So it's you can get these linear. I think part of it has to do with sampling and what you can measure. You can study what you can measure a little bit. So you can measure particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide with extreme precision fairly well, whereas mold it's a little trickier. And I know it's kind of this developing industry but we do see things like mold exacerbated asthma. Like I can tell you kind of anecdotally, like I'll have patients where they it'll be dramatic, like I have a lady with asthma that, I've just been trying to write letters to get her out of her current apartment because there's just so much mold. And it's hard because I know that, a lot of these landlords operate on pretty thin margins, and insurance doesn't pay to mitigate mold. So it's kind of a complex issue, but certainly you'll have patients whose asthma is terrible. We'll try to do some serum testing to see if they seem to be particularly mold sensitive, but that's got a lot of its own caveats. But they'll move, or they'll get new housing, or, or they'll unfortunately be so sick that they lose their housing, but, and then their breathing will change. So I don't have, I don't think our studies on that are quite as robust. And so it's a harder area to, pin down, unfortunately. For me anyway.
Great, thanks, Erika. All right, James, go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. I had a comment and a question. One of the things is that, you're talking about the data needed. I think having those indoor air quality monitors present, it gets the occupant of the building engaged. And at the same time, you get that data in essence, because then they're in control and knowing when they potentially need to cut on the fans or, do potential things in their home. But my question is regarding linking energy efficiency / healthy home assessment and work with insurance and doctors prescribing this type of work specifically for people with asthma conditions, people with COPD conditions. And so just wanted to, hear what you had to say there regarding that topic.
Yeah, I would say it's hard. Some of the thing that's hard is, I think, there's this bias that we're trying to talk more about in healthcare, is that we were all trained in med school in the individual model of disease and individual habits approach, right? Where it's like, don't, eat too much salt, don't smoke, don't whatever. We're kind of just looking at this individual, and all of us were trained that way, right? And then I think for doctors and nurses, it's just kind of overwhelming to think about. And it also feel like, well, should I prescribe you a new house? That just seems not, feasible. And so I think there's a lot of work trying to educate more doctors. I know a lot of cardiologists and lung docs are working on this too. Should we be able to prescribe HEPA filters, right? They're not that expensive compared to if an inhaler is $500 a month, my God, and a HEPA filter that'll last you 5 years is $500, and it probably has a fairly similar intervention. So I think it's honestly, I think the data is, I don't know that we need to study it that much more, honestly. There's a lot of studies showing that decreasing nitrogen dioxide, decreasing particulate matter, HEPA filters, all these things actually have benefits kind of in a whole host of populations. I think the idea of personal monitoring would be an interesting trial to see, because the hard part is, they're not the same, right? So some of those portable monitors are reasonable, right? They're pretty good, but they're not the same. There's fudge factors. So it's you also don't want to be causing someone undue stress and anxiety if you're putting something in their home that there's nothing they can do about, right? So it's if they can't really fix the air quality in their home, and then you're putting something in there that's bugging them about it, is that just going to stress them out? Or, if the monitor is not that accurate, so I think that would be interesting. I always kind of think it'd be interesting to do a trial where you, especially in wildfire country, where you just handed people indoor PM 2.5 monitors and we're hey, try to get it below 25, right? You know what I mean? And just told them, if it's not doing it, fire up some more HEPA filters, do whatever, put on another MERV 13 in a box fan. I think that would be interesting. I think there's always balance measures to things, right? So there's the side effects of something, how much does it cost their energy bills to be running all these devices? does it make them stressed out and anxious about it? Like every time they like burn some toast, are they like freaking out that they're giving their kids asthma? So I mean, there's trade-offs to all these things. And then it's kind of, you always want the KISS principle, right? Just to keep it as simple as possible, which is for anything, for inhalers, adherence, like medicines, all these sorts of things is, what kind of, I think that would be the more interesting studies is to see what happens if you let people prescribe this, if you do that sort of thing. Because I think we know that I don't think we need any more studies to say decreasing PM 2.5, nitrogen dioxide, all these things is good for people. Like I think we've got plenty of studies to show that. I think studies now on how do you implement that? Like, what's the simplest way? That's why I like that study about being like, do you just put in a stove? Do you give them a filter? Do you put on a hood? Because it may just be that hoods are like, not that we shouldn't ventilate houses and stoves. I'm not saying that, but it's just like running at the 20 minutes after you're already done cooking, like especially for people who are already worried about their energy bills and you can't smell nitrogen dioxide, people just might not do it. That might be why it just didn't work. I mean, I gotta say, like, I don't do it and I'm trying to make myself do it and I still am bad about it.
Great.
Great. Thanks for the great questions. Thank you, Erika, for.
Yeah, and I apologize if there's miscommunication on my end about timing, but I'm here for the other ones.
Not at all. Not at all. We worked it out. So thank you so much, and we'll get you back to your patients. Thank you for
Thank
joining.
you.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna go into some small group discussions now based on that presentation, and so I'm gonna hand it. Well, actually, we're gonna put the ground rules into the chat. So we won't go over these since you're all probably very familiar with them by now, but please take a look at those and be mindful of those as you discuss. And then Wing, I'll let you open up the breakout rooms. And each room
Hi there. Everybody's in breakout rooms and about to come back in 2 minutes, but I can add you to one if you like.
Oh, hi, this is Cecilia Tanaka from Northwest Natural. Sorry, I had to pop out for another phone call, so
Okay.
I'm okay not joining, but thanks. Sorry about that.
Okay, great. Hey, we will put everybody back in the same rooms they were in. What room were you in originally?
Oh, I was not in a breakout room originally.
Oh, gotcha. I misunderstood. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. I know we we got cut off there. Sorry, Adrian. If you want to add that to the chat, that'd be great. So we don't lose your thought. And for anyone else too that got cut off, if you can add that to the chat, it'd be great. Obviously, we never have enough time for these conversations. So apologize for the short time there. But thanks all for participating in that. We're gonna take a quick, let's do a 5-minute break and come back here at 1:25. So you can mute yourself and turn off your camera. We'll come back here at 1:25. Thank you. I'll take a little break. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. If you can give me maybe a thumbs up reaction or turn your camera on for a second to show that you're there, that would be great. Thank you. Awesome. So I totally skipped over the large group report back after our small group discussion. So let's jump into that really quickly before we go into our next presentation and topic. So I'll start with, let's see here. Let me go back to my notes. Let's start with Dirk's group. And if you, Dirk, could you give a quick kind of 1 minute key takeaways from your group?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Irene. Yeah, I think we had some folks comment about needing range hoods that actually bring air outside the home instead of recirculating them back inside was a concern. Surprise at needing to run the fan for 20 minutes after you're done cooking. I'm sure that person wasn't the only one that did not know that. That you need to vent electric stoves as well because of the smoke from the food and the PM 2.5 particulates. Frustration over a rental house and their bath vents going straight up into the attic and making it moldy up there. And then I think I'll finish up with just a lack of awareness and a lack of knowledge and not really knowing where to go to learn about these things. Thanks, Irene.
Great, thanks, Dirk. I'll go next and then I'll turn over to Michelle. I'll turn over to Marty and then Michelle. So in my group, yeah, we talked about similar things as well. A couple of folks switch over to electric stovetops, and then also, not aware that of gas stoves and its impact in air quality. Also, trying to block off windows with towels and like trying to find other ways to ventilate and their homes. I'm sure all of us are very familiar with that. And then in terms of information that renters might need to know, just more information and awareness around what equipment is in the home for ventilation and heating and AC and things like that, so that people understand what the utility costs are, and really making that a requirement to disclose those utility costs. And then also some thoughts about not overwhelming people with too much information and also translating materials. And then maybe even like a simple checklist of things that people should be aware of checking when they do unit visits and things like that if they're looking for rental properties. Okay, so we'll go over to Marty and then Michelle.
Thanks, Serena. I would say that a common theme in our group was need for information, and the fact that there seems the common perception is that a lot of us just don't know how to know if there's a problem, don't know what to do if there is a problem, don't know, if we're making it better or not with what we're doing. And so one of the things we talked about in that regard were air filters, right? Like, well, I bought air filters and then I ran them and then I stopped running them and I don't know if it made any difference. And how would I know? And one of the other members of our group said, it'd be great, if you can afford an air filter and you can find one when you need one. And but do you know which one to buy, right? Because this person was saying a lot of people don't know what a HEPA filter is. So I think just my big takeaway was like the need for knowledge and increased education on the topic of air quality.
Great, thanks. Michelle, do you go next?
Sure, thank you. What came up in our group was the topic of affordability for some of these mitigation strategies, whether you are a renter or a homeowner. Retrofitting, living in older housing stock and being able to retrofit both on the energy efficiency side and then on the air filtration and indoor air quality side. Again, affordability there. The absence of the means to filter air from wildfire smoke and just indoor air pollutants came up. Let's see. Just the presence of mold in Oregon. I mean, we live in a rainy climate and mold needs to be, it's everywhere. We also heard that there's not a lot of air conditioning in older housing stock or a fixer-upper, and just not having the means in which to even provide that level of filtration.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's it. Affordability, absence of retrofitting older homes or apartments, and then the absence of the means to filter air.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, Vin.
Right. Yeah, thanks everyone. Tying in the absence of air conditioning, we are going to talk about temperature standards next, and there's so many intersections with filtration, with temperature, with exposure to wildfire smoke, because how do you cool off if you're closing up your home during an extreme heat event and there's wildfire smoke and trying to keep that out, then are you trapping more heat, and how does that affect well-being? Okay, but let me get back to where I'm recapping. We are going there next. Okay, so one thing I heard is somebody who updated their home for comfort and noise, but then incorporated energy efficiency, so other aspects as part of a large kind of holistic upgrade. So installing a larger filter, replacing windows, and better sealing for energy efficiency, and adding a new vent above a gas stove. So somebody who had experience with that. And then another person shared a really good point is that newer homes might be equipped with gas, and they may not be well ventilated. But with such a tight rental market, it doesn't matter. Like, folks just need to get their housing and they can't even think about these questions. It's just more like, what can I get into next? Because it is so tight. And therefore it'd be good to have minimum standards across the board where that's not even a question that people feel like they're sacrificing. And then an example of moving into an older apartment and wasn't even sure how to figure out the ventilation. So I think that gets back to that kind of education. And on that point too, that Marty shared, kind of an overall like need for more information. There will be the office hours to learn more technical topics too, but also learn more about the process that we're in. So again, those are going to be the next 2 weeks to mid-June till the week after we're done. And so those are Mondays from 4 to 5 and Thursdays from 10 to 11. I will send out Zoom links today. Okay, and then another person talked about living with asthma in Northwest Portland, where there is some air pollution around outside, and they have heat pumps and gas stoves ventilation, but they often smell natural gas, and it's a concern. And that safety concern also came up that it should be considered because The natural leaks are scary, and there have been explosions here and in the news too when explosions happen. Okay, and then on information, one was thinking about all of the different vents. It's not just the ventilation of the hood of a stove, whether it's natural gas or electric, but also bathroom vents and dry exhaust venting. And if not, you can have a mold issue. As somebody else pointed out earlier, if it's vented to the wrong place, it can create a mold issue too. And then presented the idea of requiring landlords to list the features online to inform tenants that are related to what we've been talking about, health issues and energy. And then another one is when signing a lease for an old apartment, landlord should have to share this information, similar to what already happens with the lead disclosure right now. And that's it.
Great, thanks, Ben. Okay, well, thanks all for participating in that. We are going to switch over now to our next topic, and I'll actually hand the mic right back over to Vin to start our presentation.
Okay, am I sharing now? You all seeing that?
I don't see it.
You don't see it? Oh, from mine end, it does look like it's sharing. Okay, let me go back out. This one more time. How's that looking?
Yep, that was great.
Okay. All right, so let's switch gears a bit to temperature. So we talked a bit about health and resilience, specifically around wildfire smoke, and then the intersectional issue with indoor temperature. All right, so if you're here for the stakeholder launch that happened in February, or for our first meeting, I mentioned the heat dome last year that was a mass casualty event. 62 people died in Multnomah County, lots of heat-related stress, hospital visits. One of what I think it was the worst climate disaster that we've had in the Pacific Northwest. And I used to think of us as kind of a climate refuge that other places like from Houston and New Orleans would be moving here. And now I think like, well, maybe that's not a good idea. And especially later in wildfire smoke because of what just had happened. It was very extreme. For example, something I didn't share last time was in the last decade prior to last summer, there was only 2 deaths related to heat stress. On par with some of the worst heat waves that ever happened in the world. Hopefully we want to get another one soon. Okay, so Multnomah County has a report. If you haven't seen it, check it out, but it's on specific to the heat wave and preliminary findings. They came up with a strategy to address it going into the heat wave itself, and that was to provide space where people could cool off. So that's a potential mitigation strategy for the heat. We're going to talk about some options, and one is like, do folks need cooling, access to cooling in their homes, or is cooling shelter good enough? So they did open 3 24-hour cooling shelters for the first time in the history of the county. One in the Working Convention Center, kind of central, Arbor Lodge in North Portland, and Sunrise Center out in Rockwood. They also, during the day, offered 9 library cooling spaces for even if the libraries would typically close that day, they were open with air conditioning and water. There's a lot of outreach to those who are the most vulnerable to the heat, like seniors and folks with disabilities or the homeless. And then they also did a lot of general communication to the extreme heat risk posed to everyone. And I think we all kind of started hearing like there's something big coming. We didn't realize how big it was until we were in the middle of it though. I did share this a little bit and won't go into too much, but just consider when we have our discussion here that there is uneven distribution of heat across the city. The temperature did reach a record of 116 degrees, 1 degree shy of Las Vegas record on June 28th. Our previous record is 107. We exceeded that for 3 days in a row. But 116 at the airport is not the same as other parts of the city. You can have very cool areas like around Goose Hollow where the green infrastructure is absorbing the heat and not re-releasing it. It's actually buffering the heat. And so the temperature can be 30 degrees lower in a warm summer afternoon than, let's say, where there's a lot of pavement out in East Portland, this picture on the right, where during the heat wave, for instance, Dr. Shondas, who helped provide the data of this distribution of the urban heat island effect during a typical sunny summer afternoon, Dr. Shonda's measured 122 degrees in the afternoon in Lentz. So something to consider. And then when we look at other cities and what have been their interventions with standards, there are 3 examples here. There's also counties across the US, but here are 3 examples of cities. So in Dallas, between April 1st and November 1st, landlords have to provide cooling, air conditioning for their rental units. And their rental units cannot go above 85 degrees. So it has to be sized and maintained to do that. They only have to do 1 room, not the entire unit. Okay, and it's when the temperature outside is over 110 degrees, that's when it becomes a legal issue. But generally, this is what they have to provide. In Phoenix, the limit is 82 degrees for the maximum temperature inside a rental unit, and so they have to have air conditioning. The landlord has to provide that, and they have to be permanent. They can't just be temporary kind of in the window fixtures. They also have an option, because it's so dry down there, to use an evaporative cooling system. So you've ever heard of swamp cooler, has water in it that's absorbing heat while it's evaporating. And that can also cool down a space, and they allow 86 degrees for that. In Washington, D.C., there is a limit of 78 degrees. That's only for places that provide cooling. So it's kind of this odd thing, like if they only have air conditioning at all, they're not subject to having to meet a standard. But if they do have air conditioning, it has to be 78 degrees or 15 degrees less than the outside air temperature. So if it's 100 degrees out, that would be a typical DC heat wave between May 15th and September 15th. Then they would have to be able to reduce the temperature down to 85 degrees. So those are just some examples to think about as we go into our discussion. We are starting to see some cool, because of the heat dome, some efforts on cooling bills here in Oregon. And so inviting Oriana Magnera, who's instrumental in getting a very progressive Senate bill passed through this last state legislative session that has some access to cooling benefits to renters. So Oriana, are you here? Can we turn it over to you? Do you want to share screen, or do you want to just speak?
I'll just be speaking if that's all right. So first, I want to just name that there are many partners in this space, including Community Alliance of Tenants, Coalition of Communities of Color, Urban League, who are instrumental in helping pass this bill. But I am happy to give an overview. So Senate Bill 1536 came about because of that heat dome last summer. A number of legislators had people pass away in their district or who were deeply impacted by heat. And for many communities, this wasn't the first time this was an issue. We've had other hotter summers and many homes that are not very efficient, as has been noted in other parts of this conversation, can get very, very hot. So what Senate Bill 1536 does is it is not like the Phoenix or DC ordinances. It doesn't actually establish a safe indoor air temperature for rental units. But it does provide some clarity about how renters can have access to cooling. And so the first thing it does is many landlords had practices of preventing people from installing air conditioners, and there was a lack of clarity about why that was. Sometimes it was for aesthetic reasons, sometimes it was for safety reasons, sometimes it was for any number of reasons, but there was a lack of consistency. And so one of the things that happened during the heat wave last summer was a number of municipalities like Beaverton had to step in and mediate the landlord-tenant relationship to help people be safe when they were trying to install air conditioners that they weren't supposed to have because they were so scared of the impacts of a heat dome. So what we ended up doing in this bill was say that a landlord cannot stop someone from installing an air conditioner unless certain conditions are met. And the primary ones are if there's an issue where it would block an egress, so create a fire hazard, or interfere with state or federal law, especially around ADA accessibility. If it would not be possible to have a bunch of air conditioners in a building because of the electrical load and the fire danger that might be associated with that, or just the danger that everyone would be without life-saving power. So there are some scenarios where restrictions are still allowed. And we tried to keep that as narrow as possible and as logical as possible, but removed that general practice where an air conditioner might be considered unaesthetic. That's no longer an allowable reason to stop someone from installing an air conditioner. And then the bill also establishes that all new construction that is utilized as rentals by 2024 has to have air conditioning or some other cooling technology. And then we had wanted to do a right to cooling, but recognized that we didn't have the data to go that route. And so the Department of Energy will be studying all of the affordable housing in the state to understand what are the barriers, the costs, the opportunities, and set up the possibility of coming back and establishing a statewide right to cooling at some future time, which does not mean that the city of Portland and this project can't try to follow in the footsteps of Phoenix and Washington, D.C. and give the state a model. And then the last piece to note is there are a number of different resources that can help increase access to cooling and help reduce the landlord burden for those landlords who do want to provide access to cooling. So there's $15 million for landlords to install efficient heating and cooling pumps, and that can include the mechanical, electrical, or other upgrades that are necessary to make a cooling device functional in a space. There's $10 million for environmental justice communities and communities on bulk fuels like oil, propane, and wood stoves to convert to heat pumps, which actually is not an insignificant portion of the community in Multnomah County who are using one of those sources as their primary heating source. And then there's $4.5 million for cooling centers. 2 goes to cities and counties and tribal and other kinds of governments for the purposes of establishing warming, cooling, or air shelters that supplements existing work. And then there's also $2 million for landlords to be able to put together their own cooling centers. And we had wanted to have a requirement for a cooling center on the premise, but realized that there were a lot of scenarios in which that wasn't viable. So creating a voluntary program will help to gather the data to understand what is necessary to establish spaces, especially for those buildings where not everyone can have an air conditioner, that there is a space close to home for people with mobility issues or pets or who just don't want to be in a congregate setting, that they can have something provided by their landlord. So that's kind of the general pieces of the bill, some of which may be amplifiable in this work in Portland, and some of which, Portland may be able to build off of that in a really meaningful way.
Great. Thanks so much, Oriana. Any questions at all about what you heard and on Vin's presentation or Oriana's presentation as well? Questions or comments? Feel free to use the chat as well, or you can also raise your hand. See some clapping.
Well, one idea I'll share that came up that you just made me think of, Oriana, as well, we're waiting for questions to come in, is air conditioning versus heat pumps. So an air conditioner could, we would expect to increase energy utility costs. And so that's a factor, that it makes housing less affordable. And it does increase carbon emissions too. And so a heat pump is a solution that, although it costs more to install, long-term will drive down carbon emissions because it is operating in reverse of an air conditioner. And when it operates in reverse, it's 4 times plus more efficient than just straight electrical resistance, like using like a cadet heater or baseboard heating. So that is a solution that could drive down carbon emissions and climate impact. And in doing so, it's driving down the cost, particularly for that winter heating bill. So just noting that there's that technology out there. And I really love to hear that solution that came out of the state legislature, Oriana.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was an important piece. And I forgot to mention there's also $5 million for emergency air conditioner deployment. We tried to think about both the long and the short term, that heat pumps are better long-term, more permanent solution, but not accessible to many renters and costly and take more time. If there's a heat dome or a heat wave coming, people aren't going to have the time to install a heat pump in the way that you can just stick an air conditioner in the window. So it's, I think, important until we have the full transition to heating and cooling pumps to make sure that we have air conditioners available for people as a life-saving technology, even if it does have some negative environmental impacts and impacts to our energy usage.
I had not heard that. And so we have something similar in the city of Portland already for folks that are concerned about the summer through the Portland Clean Energy Fund. There is a heat response effort that's about on the scale of $10 million just for Portland. It is delivered through community-based organizations. And so that's something to consider. It's not, there are some qualifications there to receive those heat pumps, and they are portable heat pumps. So it's kind of for that immediate, like air conditioning this summer, and then driving down the winter heating costs following summer. They're portable, they go with a tenant. The tenant actually owns them in the end. What we're looking at is a really long-term policy that is less short-term. And so we'd be looking at requirements for landlords to install permanent systems, as we saw in those other 3 cities. But also, I haven't checked the chat. Are there questions in there, Irene?
Yeah, Diana has her hand raised. Go ahead, Diana.
I guess on some level, some of my question was just responded to by the discussion we just had, but it looked like from the very first meeting we had that Seattle, Washington, D.C. and LA have put significant investments in heat pumps to low income community members. And it feels like that is kind of a first time step that would actually both reduce emissions and address the heat issue. And that feels like a kind of a really doable thing for us to focus on in kind of a big investment way. And it was good to see that City Council yesterday was doing something with that, and what Vin just added. It is disconcerting if we're going to start adding kind of air conditioning, which is not very energy efficient and worsen the problem at the same time we're trying to solve the problem. It does feel like there needs to be like some real priorities of solutions that will get us to where we need to be and help with the added costs, because they are costly. And so it's good to, I wanted to just kind of ask more about what the city sees itself doing, or what we as this group can do to encourage that kind of move forward.
It's a good segue into our discussion, because we want to hear from you all and learn from each other. So that we have lots of ideas, but what we want to do is really hear from the stakeholders here, rather than we have plans. There's a lot happening, and there's a lot happening within community organizations too, like Verde, that Oriana just shared, works for Verde, and they have a heat pump program that we watched a video that's just amazing, working with the Energy Trust of Oregon. So there are efforts on multiple levels that are happening, but we need more. And so that's a question to come up in discussion today. One thing to consider is that on the last meeting that we have on June 1st, we'll talk about who pays. But there is a reality that there are some costs, and there's air conditioning raises utility costs, investing into heat pumps and other solutions like that, although it may reduce utility costs, are very expensive, in the order of $10,000 versus less than $1,000 for an air conditioning unit or air conditioning units that cover a whole apartment. And so at $10,000, then somebody has to pay for it, and landlords often pass through that cost to renters. And so that's something else we need to be cognizant of as we have our discussions. But we will get to a who pays, trying to solve for that. So we don't inadvertently increase the cost of housing through rent because we're requiring more sophisticated long-term technologies like heat pumps. That might be a good time to move that direction.
Yeah, let's do that. Just a quick look at the chat here. Oriana, or maybe Vin, could you add the name of the cooling bill that Oriana was talking about, just in case people want to learn more about it, in the chat? And then Adele asked a question: how many homes is it estimated 1536 will affect? Do we know that?
Oriana, were you able to answer that? Or others? Community Alliance of Tenants might be here right now too. Kim, are you here? Or Multifamily Northwest was involved too.
Oh, maybe not. Well, we can follow up and get you a response to that question. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's move on to our kind of couple activities here. So we wanted to start off with a polling question based on just to get a sense of what you all think an appropriate temperature max is for rental housing. So really, we wanted the objective of, and then we'll go into breakout discussion, and we'd like to ask you, what kind of access to cooling do you and your community need? Do you and your communities need, considering current barriers like higher utility costs and landlord pass-through of investment costs? So thinking about cooling day or night, is it only one room or a whole unit? Offsite cooling centers versus on-site. So we want to kind of understand the standards that and make sure the standards assure tenant health and well-being is protected during extreme heat events. So like the 2021 heat dome. So as Vin mentioned, in the June 1st meeting, we'll be discussing kind of how to pay for the implementation of those types of standards. But yeah, I would love to get your feedback on that today. So let's go into our live polling here, and you might be familiar with this already. We did this at the last meeting. So let me share my screen here and I'll present. So this is going to be a live polling question that you all will participate in. Let me present this. And Wing is going to put, oh, he's already done that. So you'll find a link in the chat to, and if you click on that link, it'll take you to this, what you're seeing on my screen right now. So I see some hearts coming through, letting me know that you're there, which is great. Thank you so much. If you have any troubles with this, you can also go to menti.com and type in this link here, 61798956. So that's another way to do it. You could do it on your phone as well if you have a smartphone. And if you're having any other troubles, feel free to send a message to us in the chat box. Okay, so just one question here. It's a multiple choice question, and we'll just see what people think. So the question is, based on experiences during the heat dome, what's an appropriate temperature max that rental housing should be in? So it ranges from 78 to 85, and there's also an option if you're not sure.
I love these live polls, and thanks everyone for participating. This is a great way to kind of, when we look at the ranges from DC over to Phoenix, it's a pretty wide range. And we really need to come up with a number that suits Portland specifically with consideration of that heat dome.
Yes, I think we have a little less than maybe 30 folks participating, so we'll wait for a couple more here to respond. So looks like there's kind of a bit of a split here between 78 and 85, and then some also in between, which is interesting, but.
That is really interesting. Now, I guess we didn't get much clarity out of that. So if we have some time within our small group breakouts, if you want to clarify, if you're at either that extreme, like I'd really like to hear more. And there is that kind of qualification in DC that it's, they have a really low temperature limit, but it's also 15 degrees less than the extreme of that. I don't even know why they have the 78. Maybe it's just easier as a baseline.
Yeah. Okay, so it's like we have about 25 folks. Maybe I'll wait another maybe 10 seconds if there's other folks that want to enter in a response here.
Can I?
Okay, go ahead.
Can I say something? Last year during the event, we had our heat pump break, And so when I talked to the heat pump person, a lot of cooling devices can only physically produce a certain differential, which is why when it's 115 degrees, 85 is actually lucky. And so I think we need to kind of think about that piece, is just the physical capabilities of the equipment. And I'm just going to add one other kind of cool thing, is talking to that heat pump person. There's a dearth of people who can do these installations, et cetera, and they would love to partner with BIPOC groups that would like to train folks to come into this field. And so I think that's a real opportunity for PSEF or other organizations, is to use this as an area for job development.
Yeah, so the High Road Advisory Council just formed with PSEF for workforce development. That's a really good point, and that's the purpose of it.
Cool.
Interesting point. I put in a heat pump in my home in 2007. At the time, it was sized for the heating, and the person who put it in, who had very knowledgeable, still comes and maintains it. It's worked awesome since. It's for a very long time now, 15 years, never broken down. So I'm sorry that happened, but they said, oh, you'll never need the cooling potential. Size it for heating, you'll be oversized for cooling. And it's always been great to keep our home at 75 degrees in summer during the heat waves, which is when we really use it, when it gets above 90 or so. But during the heat wave on that third day in a row where we hit that 116 degrees, we could only get it down to 85. So that's a really good point. We might need to have some, considering where the weather is going, we might have to have some exceptions, but I was thankful for the 85. So I'll put it that way. I would take 90 too if I had to, if that kind of extreme heat, but much better than 120. All right. Well, how about we move on to this discussion?
Yeah.
Question?
Yep. So thanks all for participating in that. Okay. So Wayne's going to break out the rooms, and we'll go right back into small group discussions, and we'll come back at 2:20.
If you just joined, everyone's in breakout sessions, so I'm going to move you.
Yeah, I was in Vin's and my computer went to sleep and then when I was logging back on, it let me out of the meeting.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, you answered my question. So I'll move you to Vin's. Andrew. Okay.
Hey there, guys. I got bounced out too, and so could you put me? I don't care where you put me. Just put me somewhere.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Luck of the draw. I'll put you in room 5. Hey, Jeremy, did you mean to pop back into the main room?
No, my computer went to sleep and it kicked me out of my.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
Which room were you in? I can put you back in there.
It was done with Jordan, and then I'm blanking on.
Oh yeah, Michelle.
Yeah, Michelle.
Okay. Hold on just a second.
Recording in progress.
Great, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you all had a little bit more time to chat than the previous topic, but so let's do some large group report outs. We'll go in the same order that we went on to last time. So we'll go to Dirk and maybe like a 1-minute report out, and then we'll go to myself and then go to Marty.
Hi there. Thanks, Irene. Yeah, boy, that was a good one. Folks had lots to say on this. There was some, sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice. I've got a bit of a chest thing, so bear with me. There was some concern over passing on the costs of cooling to the renter. We had a lot of discussion around these cooling centers and who uses them, if they get used. The preference for on-site versus off-site was pretty clear. Off-site is probably difficult for the most vulnerable people in the community, so access and getting there was a real concern. There was some disappointment around like recent Portland Bureau of Transportation work that was done in someone's neighborhood and the lack of shade trees put in after doing that work. Apparently it'd been some time and they hadn't gotten to that yet. So before I lose my voice, I'll pass it on. Thanks, Ari.
Thanks, Dirk. So our group talked about, let's see here. So it sounded like during the heat dome, having cooling during the day might be more preferable, and having at least one room to cool if possible. Then having an option to go offsite is also seems important. Developing climate resilience hubs to act as cooling centers, but also, could that be spaces be a little bit more versatile? So can it provide childcare and workforce development and other types of services? Finding ways to offset costs of upgrades to units, maybe try to do or think about using more passive systems and providing funding support for more mechanical systems. But then also made another person made the point that passive systems might not be great for fire season. So also having that mechanical sort of option as well is key. And then it seems like a lot of communities are using maybe kind of a single room to cool to save on costs. So having on-site access is great, but having off-site options is great as well. At the end of the day, increasing access it seems to be the most important. And then another group member mentioned that Miami has a chief heat officer. So having some type of navigator or ambassador during heat events to support vulnerable populations. So making sure that outreach is just as is prioritized as much as the actual technology as well. Those are some key takeaways from our group. And then I'll pass it over to Michelle. Oh, sorry, I'll go to Marty and then Michelle, sorry.
Sure. Okay, I will second our group's concern about the costs of cooling. So we had a couple different people point out that they had firsthand experience with people who had cooling but didn't want to use it because of the cost. And so this idea of having to marry provision of cooling services with some kind of cost control, because cooling services for people who don't want to pay the cost or are worried about the cost are essentially the same as no cooling services. And there was also a lot of conversation in our group about this idea of preparedness and how something like a preparedness plan, like an emergency plan, like doing fire drills, like this idea of helping people be prepared for, in this case, right, a heat event is absolutely critical. And so we talked about that in a couple different ways. So preparedness of individuals, like so that individual households understand what they will do in that situation, but also preparedness in terms of our infrastructure. And so one of our group members brought up something that I believe Dirk just mentioned, which is shade trees, right? Shade trees could be looked at as one form of preparedness for heat events. So investing in things like that will help relieve our need for things like mechanical cooling, which, you know, we all know have multiple downsides. Yes, that's my recap. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Marty. Michelle?
Hi, this is such a rich conversation. In our group, we heard from one member that has a neighborhood that is got the infrastructure, such as access to a library that has long hours, and is also fairly close to a city county shelter that's a year-round shelter that could potentially be used, and that there's a moderate number of trees. And there's kind of a neighbor watching neighbor situation there. We had others that talked about retrofitting older buildings with better insulation, and questioned, you know, if not a heat pump, then what? If a heat pump actually is not working when the temperature gets to a certain degree outside, there's no cool air to pull from, that might be a problem. Is air conditioning for every single unit reasonable, or do we look at room by room, as someone earlier mentioned? Another participant talked about solving through building technologies, such as improved windows that have a higher insulative values, shading the windows, mandating awnings and overhangs to prevent sunlight on windows, adding tree canopy. Another participant asked about or advocated for serving communities that really needed it. So I'm assuming low-income communities that have fewer access to infrastructure that will help them stay cool. There was a comment in our group that, you know, people probably don't want to leave their homes, so having something close by in the case of multifamily, maybe using the social room would be better than having an offsite place to go get cool. And then there was a question about, has cooling been included in school modernizations and PPS school buildings, which are dispersed in neighborhoods, but the buildings are very old. They're 80 to 100 years old in some cases, or older, and there's absolutely no air conditioning. So that was a question. Anyway, that's our report out.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And then last but not least, Vinh.
Michelle, the last one, I'm glad that the chair of the school board was in the room to answer some of those questions. Here to pass. So yes, very similar, you know, a lot of thoughts on better to be on site, not to have to, hard for folks to take their families off site, especially if it's not a 24-hour kind of situation. On site, initially like thinking one room is sufficient, at least as a first step before getting to whole units. But that we really need to consider what's the square footage of that one room and how many folks live in there. Are there multiple generations? Are there multiple families living in there? That there might need to be some exceptions beyond one room right from the start. And then we talked a little bit about cost burden for an entire unit versus one room, and that maybe we can reach more folks, more units for investment for more space. By having one room at a time, we could cover more units initially, but then maybe a long-term goal of covering entire units with air conditioning or some type of cooling. And I really like, I think that's about what I have here. I was specific to about nighttime temperatures too, and that it's very important to have nighttime cooling because the temperatures were still in the 90s during the heat dome overnight. All right, a lot about just like, where's the cost mitigation? So there needs to be some type of cost mitigation so it's not passed through to tenants. And then one thing I'll just point out too is like how I really appreciated hearing the other ideas here that are also very building related, because that is what we're focused on right now, like adding trees. This is a long-term effort, and so planting trees now could get to the benefits 20 years from now, which then, although air conditioning and heat pumps, a heat pump is basically an air conditioner. It is an air conditioner, then runs in reverse in winter, but they result in more carbon emissions. And so having those trees come in and provide that shading then reduces the amount of fuel that's needed especially in this kind of early time period before our electric is more renewable. So that's something to balance there. Is like, what's our near-term need? Where's electricity going in the future in terms of renewable energy? So I really appreciate hearing that. And then the awnings, like, what a simple fix to just like provide some cover on the outside rather than shades on the inside. So yeah, should I wrap it up here? We have less than a minute. So next meeting, equitable energy standards. I will talk about some of the intersectional issues here with what happens when the power goes out, community-based energy, renewable energy. And then I will send out, as we've been talking about, we've almost got a place reserved. I think tomorrow we'll have it secured, a place where we can all come together with the building working group and the tenant working group on June 8th, 12 to 2:30, same thing Wednesdays. And I really learn from each other and talk about how the city can best provide resources like around workforce development mentioned today, resource hubs for both owners and landlords and tenants. So thanks everyone. Oh, I went a minute over. Got to go then. Appreciate you all today.
Thanks everyone. Appreciate it.